Okay. All right. So let me start back up again. And what I should say is that I've got basically two stories to tell, and if we don't get to the second one, that's totally fine. But one is about a group of people traditionalists in Ghana, and the question of whether any of them have something like a psychotic process. And then the second is about culture and voice hearing. And I think I sent around this one piece that I wrote for the British Journal of Psychiatry. There's a bunch of unpublished material about basically claiming that, in fact, Americans really do have a more negative take. So if we get there, that's great. But in any event, okay, so is the shaman schizophrenic after all? I'm going to begin with a graduation ceremony. This is about 45 seconds, and this came from an evening in Ghana. As what we were doing, I was there as part of this big project, and there were four of us interlopers who went to this ceremony. And Kara Weissman had brought a camcorder and gave it to somebody who was a member of the group, and that person took this kind of amazing video. To follow what's going on, follow the woman in the white sheet. She is the person who is graduating. Okay, so she has been training for a couple of years at this point to be in a kung fu. This is somebody who speaks to the gods, and she is demonstrating her authority by essentially demonstrating her authority over the fire. So she had been preparing for this night arguably for 2 years. She would dance in the fire 9 times over the course of the evening. She spent a couple of seconds in there each time. The fire is a little bit of a red herring, but I think it's pretty cool, so I thought I would just show it to you. This is the kind of sign that you see around Ghana. So the Great Mosi is somebody that I came to know. So you see people advertising their skills. These are folks who are serving often as the first line of medical defense for their community. So people will go to them for a variety of ills, and they will treat those ills with herbal medicine. And the more dramatic the ill, the more they will also interact with the gods. And what they also do is to keep malevolent forces at bay. And they are sometimes kept on a retainer by local businessmen. Some people who do this are not so wealthy. Some are very, very wealthy. They live in a world of many gods. So the idea of an akomfu is that this is a system that's not unlike voodoo or candomblé or bahia. You've got one big god at the top of a pyramid, and then you have sort of named gods below, and then you have just an array of ancestral gods or local gods or gods of trees or gods of whatever. And the person who becomes the traditionalist or the akomfu will have an altar, or actually often several altars in their shrine. And on this altar is the point of interaction with the gods. And the person who the person will feed the god. So once a year, the god is fed with a blood sacrifice. Typically, an akomfu has an initial relationship with one god, and then will develop more and more gods that they relate to. And so an akomfu shrine will often be quite crowded with 20 or even 30 particular places where the god will come. And the akomfu will give gifts to the god on sort of an everyday basis with schnapps. They will spray alcohol over the god. And the god will visit, and the god is both local and general. So as you can have, a particular kung fu can have a relationship with a god in this site, and that same god can also have another relationship with another kung fu in another site. But there's this kind of physical model of the gods as well. So you can, one of our interlocutors kind of went to somebody who was ill. They thought that a northern god would be helpful, so they drove to the north of Ghana to pick up the god and bring him back. And so you bring back the stuff in which the god is sitting, and then you place it in your shrine, and then you feed the god. So the important point here is that this cultural model, so this is what a phrase anthropologists use to describe the ways a local community will talk about some event or set of ideas, and this is what people will say about who becomes an okomfu. So the story is, somebody becomes an okomfu, and if the god calls, often out loud, that when the god calls, the person will become possessed. So everybody I'm talking about is able to dissociate. They're possessed by the god, the person is very dramatic. The human is very dramatic. Everybody knows that they've been possessed, and they will become amnestic for their experience. So the first possession, they're like down on the floor. It's very evident. They're behaving like they're a mad person. It's said, this is part of the model, that the human who's been called does not want to receive the call. There are very good reasons for doing this. If you're going to go through the apprenticeship, you've got to drop out of school. The apprenticeship itself involves wearing a sheet for 2 years and not wearing shoes and not having sex, and you're also an apprentice to some master who you may or may not like. During this period, it's said that the person who is struggling to receive the call, that they are mad. They're a little crazy. Once they accept the call, they go through a training process, this 2-year apprenticeship. Apprenticeship models vary from person to person, but people will often say that you must learn to know the gods, to hear them more clearly, to distinguish between the good gods and the bad demons, and you have to figure out how to call them. The training process involves practicing possession, so people who go through this process are possessed repeatedly. When the process is complete, the cultural model says that the person will love the gods. This is often honored in the breach. And it's said that if the person doesn't accept the call, they will go mad. And in another piece of this project, I was spending time at the local Cape Coast Hospital, and I met 2 of the 23 or 4 people I talked to, in fact, said part of their history of their experience was that they had been called by the gods and they'd refused the call, and that's why they were mad. Okomfu are funky people in Ghana. This is a society in which people often dress exceptionally well. Okomfu, as I was driving up to one of my interviews, my driver said, Okomfu are dirty. I don't like them. They have this kind of quality of and this is a Okomfu who's actually possessed and dancing at the same ceremony in front of the band. They are Christians. 70% of Ghana is Christian. Will say that Okomfu are consorting with demons. At the same time, many Christians will also will be clients of Okomfu when they have need. So they have this kind of funny status. The key point is that they talk actively, clearly, repeatedly about hearing invisible others speak with auditory voices. And this is meant to be something that you do if you are this kind of professional in Ghanaian society. And so there's an obvious question, whether these folks have a kind of madness that's managed through spiritual practice. And you probably don't need this definition, but psychosis is often used to describe an illness in which people experience a radical break with what's understood to be reality. People have perceptual experiences that normal people don't have, and ideas about the world that, again, normal people don't have. So when anthropology was young and romantic, people were very excited about the idea that our person with schizophrenia was their shaman. And the canonical article is often identified as Ruth Benedict's 1934 Anthropology and the Abnormal. And the point of this article was that normal is always relative to a cultural idea. It's always relative. There's no absolute standard for normalcy. And she says at one point, it doesn't matter what kind of abnormality we choose for illustration. There are well-described cultures in which these abnormals function at ease and with honor and apparently without danger or difficulty in the society. And it's actually a pretty sophisticated argument about the interaction between culture and temperament. Later on, she does talk, in this article, she talks about people who appear to be mentally unstable in one society who are in fact doing just fine in another society. So this becomes the illustration of the argument that our person with schizophrenia is their shaman. And so the person that we identify with psychosis, who drops out of life and becomes disabled, is really doing fine elsewhere. It's an indictment of modern society. There was pushback even at the time. So George Devereux wrote a piece that is often taken as the most famous pushback, in which he says, look, the shaman is mentally deranged. The shaman is passing, but the shaman is really quite crazy. The shaman is not a well-adjusted person in another society. And this is the kind of thing that people would argue about, whether how much the inner experience of the psychotic shaman was actually healthy or unhealthy in another world. But you could argue that by the 60s, the romantic vision had carried the day. That Artie Lang, that Thomas Szasz, Michel Foucault, Thomas Scheff, in one way or another, are arguing that the stuff of the people who become psychotic in our society were driving them crazy. They would do better in some other social world. There's something corrupted about modernity that in which our social behavior is changing the way that people react to their environment, and these quirky people become crazy and psychotic, and it doesn't happen elsewhere. It's a little bit of a quick summary of these perspectives. And then, of course, psychiatry changed. There's this famous article at the time written, published in 1976 by Jane Murphy, also an anthropologist. And it's really a very good article. She points out that everywhere in the world, there's a pattern that comprises hallucinations, delusions, disorientations, behavioral aberrations that's associated with losing your mind, and that it doesn't describe shamans. That shamans, in fact, are maybe playing at being mentally ill, but they're not sick. Everybody knows it. Everybody distinguishes between the person who is the shaman and the person who has lost their mind. And so she says, rather than being violations of the social norms, as labeling theory suggests, symptoms of mental illness are manifestations of a type of affliction shared by virtually all mankind. And of course, 4 years later, the DSM-3 is published, presenting the vision that psychiatric illness is a disease like any other. You identify these illnesses by observable symptoms, and you treat them by medication. And I think you can make the argument that schizophrenia at this point becomes a poster child for a biomedical brain disorder. that it exists. Certainly when I was doing my research in psychiatry, and I would talk to young residents about the message they wanted to convey, they would say, schizophrenia is not caused by the mother. It is a thing in the brain. That's the message. That's really clear because we have hurt people in the past by suggesting that society drove people crazy. It's a thing in the body, and it produces these experiences. So, you can ask whether the Akomfu have a schizophrenia-like condition that's managed by spiritual practice. And if you say yes, that suggests that social practices may help with the treatment of schizophrenia, and that maybe schizophrenia is not as organic as we thought. So I would say that many psychiatric scientists are sort of on this train at this point, that one of the big shifts in thinking about psychiatry is the recognition that social defeat and other, being born poor, living urban, being beaten up by life, being sexually abused. There are a number of social factors that increase the risk that somebody will develop schizophrenia. I would bet that clinicians in general are a little less likely to think about the social origins of the conditions of schizophrenia. Okay, then we have the problem of thinking about religious experience and whether religious experiences manage psychosis. I'm not going to go through this again. I do want to raise the question, or to point out that's in the free-for-all that it constitutes the psychiatric scientists who argue about the nature of psychosis. There is a position that says that all voice hearing, some voice hearing, is dissociative and due to trauma. And so in raising this possibility, I want to just quickly lay out some distinctions that most of you are probably familiar with, but I'll just in case, let me lay it out. So psychosis, our best example of psychosis, this whatever we mean by this category, is schizophrenia. I am struck by the clinical representation of the experience of psychosis as, it's hard to put into words, but you know it when you see it. There's a smell of psychosis. Cognitive disorganization, as we were talking about, it's often clinicians will often talk about this as the most important feature of schizophrenia. Voices are often thought to be central to schizophrenia, although arguably you're really looking at 70% of people who report voices on a regular basis. Dissociation is another mess. It clearly is something that's real, and people have trouble drawing a bright line around dissociation. Its best example is post-traumatic stress disorder. Its central characteristic is trance. When people experience dissociative disorder, they often black out and become amnestic for things that they do when a trance-like event happens to them. So dissociative identity disorder, there you really get people who describe themselves as becoming somebody else, doing things like buying shoes. They come back, they revert, the human steps out of that trance-like state. They see the shoes in their closet, they're confused about how they got there. Dissociation is often associated with trauma. People clearly, the literature will talk about normal dissociation, but trauma is often highly salient in discussing clinical dissociation. And I think the clinical literature agrees that voices happen with dissociation. So, back to Ghana. So this is the project I was telling you about. This is our Ghana team. So Nana Peterson, Kara Weissman, John Doolin, and Vivian Zakoto. This is when I was out there. And what they did, or what Vivian and John did, is they did these 40 really rich interviews with the Akomfu and 40 really rich interviews with Christians. So they do these interviews on spiritual experience. The mind is relevant, but I'm not going to talk about that here. And one of the central questions was, have you ever heard the gods or God or the gods speak in a way that you could hear with your ears? And so normally, this is a 2-hour interview that people are doing. And they found there were 18 voice hearers who heard voices once a week or more often out of the sample of 40 Kakomfu and 40 charismatic Christians. And so half of them are Kakomfu, half of them are Christian. So I go in, and one of the things that what I do is to then sit with people for an hour or more. This is a mixture. So John did the interviews in English. He spoke with the urban Akomfu. English is a language of instruction in Ghana. Vivian spoke in Fante to the rural Akomfu. And then we had that translated. I sat with John's research assistant who spoke fluent Fante. So most of my interviews were in English, but some of them were in Fante. There are many limitations to these data, but it's a really interesting question, so that's why worth exploring. I also did something that was useful. So I took Pat Deegan, is an American who meets criteria for schizophrenia. She also serves as a psychologist. She has a PhD in psychology. And she, with colleagues, created a 45-minute, 50-minute track that gives you the experience of hearing voices. It's quite cool. I used to send my students out I'd give them the track and send them out for 45 minutes to check out a book out of the library and get a cup of coffee and stuff like that. I took a 45-second snippet of that, and then we had a Fante speaker replicate the English language voices on the track and substituted those in, and we created this track, which I will now play for you in English. And so this is the original Pat Deegan track. And what I did with this track is that I use it in a different way, as you'll see later in the discussion. But if in this case, I would play the track and I would say, is this like your experience? Is this what the gods sound like to you? And what I want you to do in listening to the track, because it's going to come up later, is that I want you to listen to the fact that there's a positive voice, a soft, seductive female positive voice that comes up, and then it's overlain by a negative voice, by a mean male voice. So here we go.
I came for you because you are the one. You're the one I came for. Stop! You are the one. It's you. It's you I came for. It's you.
Look at your eyes.
Look at
them. Your eyes are full of disgust.
You have the way.
You smell. You are disgusting.
You know you.
Looking at you and seeing you and seeing everything you do, and you are disgusting. Hey, stop it! Stop it now! Don't touch that. Don't touch it.
Okay. And I should say, by the way, that was painted by the woman that you saw pictures me with to represent her experience of psychosis. So, 18 people. I sit with them at the end of our Yeah.
Was it postpartum psychosis that she was describing, or?
No. She just thought that a screaming baby was part of her story. And this also has political dimensions. She thought that Roe v. Wade should be overturned. And so as the pictures developed over time, this is just my best slide of it, so I use this, but it has a fetus that's being murdered, and I think she heard a lot of screams, and so I think that's why. Okay, so this is what I thought I heard. So what I'll do is describe this to you and then give you some case examples of the people that I spoke with. So I thought I saw 4 groups of people. I wouldn't want to be held to this in a court of law. I know that I think there are at least 4 different individuals who are really, really different. Am I completely persuaded that person 6 of the first group doesn't belong in the second? I mean, I don't know. But I think that there was one group in which people would say things like, that's exactly what they sound like. So I played that track, which is not a pleasant track. And I say, do the gods sound like that? And 6 people said, absolutely, that's exactly what they sound like. From my conversation with them, it seemed that they had pretty active, audible voices. They had pretty audible negative voices that were managed but not controlled, and that other people thought they were pretty weird. That's a scientific category for you. I just thought that when they told me their story about, because everybody has a story of, like, the god called them and they were behaving oddly and were they going to become a kung fu. These 6 people, I thought that other people, from their story, from their own retrospective account, I thought there was a pretty good chance that they looked really crazy to other people. Then there was another group. So group 2 were people who endorsed, but I thought maybe a little less enthusiastically. They had audible and negative voices. They did trauma talk. So I asked everybody whether they had experienced trauma and sexual trauma when they were a kid. And many people said no. Some people said yes. That, of course, does not mean that other people did not experience trauma. But in this group, people spent a lot of time talking about their trauma. And I was struck by that. And they didn't tell stories of other people thinking that they were weird. Then there were a group of people who were either weakly endorsed or I wasn't persuaded by the endorsement. And they denied trauma. Their audible experience was less prominent. They seemed to be having a great time. They liked their trance. And then there were a group of people that I thought just didn't hear voices, or at least when they talked about their experience, they were talking about their experiences voices, but it was more internal stuff, or it was sleep stuff. It wasn't. So let me tell you a little bit about what I thought I saw. This is Mary. This is my best example of somebody who I think has something like a psychosis process. Mary's doing fine. We're double checking that now, so Vivian's back talking to her now. She told me she saw 15 to 22 clients a week. She's in an area that's pretty far from a clinic. When we first met with her, she was having a wedding at her house. She's clearly got a position of lovely house, position of local prominence. She became an kung fu when her business failed in her early 40s. She ran into the bush, which is also a local sign of madness. She clearly had auditory events even now. She was clearly looking as I was talking with her. She was very funny about snakes because she said, you find the gods in the bush, but you have to be really careful because they sound just like snakes, and so you'll hear the snakes, and sometimes it's actually a snake. And I was like, oh, okay, this is an auditory experience. She had a lot of demons. She was totally comfortable with the track. She gave a lot of examples. She spoke to her neighbors when they weren't physically present. Her neighbors would speak to her in invisible form. I thought she had a certain amount of cognitive dysfunction. So my interview with her, the interviews that John had done with her, there's a little looseness to the interaction. George is much more of a puzzle to me. So George is, that's exactly what I hear. And when I sat and talked to George, and I talked to him for 10 hours, and John talked to him for a long time, and Vivian was talking to him again this week. So he's very clear. He hears voices 3 to 5 times a week, every 3 to 5 days. Very clearly indicates auditory events. He turns his head when we're talking. It talks about demons, says he's learned not to pay attention to the demons, says the demons hiss. says that there are many demons now as there were when he was a kid, told a very persuasive story about how he was kind of crazy when he was, like he's behaved so oddly that his aunt told his mom to take him to the hospital. Instead, his aunt takes him to the local kung fu for training. He stays there for 3 years. He spontaneously says to me in English that he's learned to control his experiences, and that's what you do when you go for training. Okay, so here's Bill. Bill likes the shouting man, says it sounds like the devil to him. But he launches into the story, not, half an hour into the interview, about being raped by some guy. Never told his mom. He cries during the interview. He says that after he was being raped as a teenager, it was a repeated experience. After he was raped, he started hearing this sound in his ear, which he recognized from the track. I started going to church, bought one of those books that you can get these manuals in America as well, The Art of Listening to God. It tells you how to pray so that you focus on God and you don't pay attention to other things. And he's very, very active as a prayer, doesn't hear this anymore. He hears demons every day. I wasn't sure whether that was an auditory experience or an idea that he's being tempted by whatever. It's a little hard to tell. This is our candidate. So this is the woman in the fire. She really liked the track, but then as she was talking about the track, she actually didn't talk about hearing the gods at all. She talked about seeing the gods. Many people are actually frightened of the gods. She is not. She loves the gods. They're just great. As we talked, she really backed off because, me, the anthropologist, I keep pushing. So it was really with your ears, did you, she really backed off. And so my sense, is that it was more of a vivid, imagined experience. And here's Lily. Thought that this psychosis track she'd never heard anything like it. This could be a convocation of witches, and thank you very much, she wasn't having anything to do with it. She talked about hearing God speak with sound inside her mind. And in fact, this mostly happened in the middle of the night. So in this part of the world, the middle of the night is where the malevolent forces are at their most intense. And so it's an act of goodness, nobility, power to wake up and pray. Many, many Christians do this. And she did say that sometimes when she was praying, God would speak and she'd turn her head to see who was speaking. So 40% of humans have, judged by one study, have some sensory experiences on the edge of sleep and awareness. I'm inclined to think that that's the kind of experience she was reporting. So I'm willing to bet, hypothesize, suggest that group 1 has something like a psychotic process. It's not schizophrenia, they're doing fine. So they're not, group 2, something more like a trauma dissociation process, which doesn't mean that people in group 1 can't also have something of a trauma dissociation process. Group 3, I thought they loved trance. They were just enjoying, it was like a world of invisible friends. It was just fun. And group 4 are people who kind of want to hear God, but don't really in this psychiatric sense. So my suggestion, was that a question? Yeah.
Just because earlier you said that the voice hearing isn't quite like hearing outside, it's something in between, like at the beginning of, and now it's more like it's an audible voice. So would that be something you like stick to? Because when you ask, like in the clinic, if you force a patient to say, do you hear it this way or this way, you're pushing them to give you something.
Right.
Whereas actually when you just let them describe, it's very much this in-betweenness of them not actually being able to localize it, and then at some point
Right.
it becoming someone else, and if it's someone else, it can't be in me, and therefore it's outside, but it's not actually phenomenologically outside.
Right. So I think that this is a very deep question. So I think that humans make two judgments about funky experiences. There's the me, not me. Did I generate it? Did something else generate it? And inside, outside. And so to be fully auditory, it's got to be outside, and it's got to be not me. And, you know, culture will play a role in how people are making those decisions. So, I mean, so when Nev Jones and I wrote this paper, she went back through, I had done a bunch of interviews in the hospital with Americans, with folks in Accra, and in folks in Chennai. She went back through those interviews and carefully coded them and said, you know, at least 40% of these are not outside voices. And so that, you know, the point of that research was to say, no, this is not all auditory. When you're talking to folks who are talking to God, they have a pretty powerful invitation to have external experiences. I don't, both because of the awkwardness of doing the interviews. I'm this white person who's just swanned in from outside, and because of the kind of phenomenological, the descriptive capacities of the person who's talking to me. I mean, between the mind and the world doesn't really have a place in much of that. So I was reasonably confident. So I kept going for the follow-up outside your head, either ears, did you turn to see? And so I so that's what John and Vivian were doing. That's how we got to this group of 18. I was persuaded, so in all but that last group, I was persuaded that there was some auditory dimension. It's always a guess. Exactly what's going on? You know, the trancy types, I'm thinking that it's a little bit more interior than outside, but I'm certainly bringing in my expectations into that as well. So it's complicated. You know, the psychiatric scientists, so these folks in Durham and King's College London and the Jim Van Osses of the world, they are very excited about seeing a similarity between the non-psychotic and psychotic, because they want to say that many psychotic experiences are not auditory, and so it shouldn't matter whether the folks who are not psychotic are having an auditory experience. I am much more comfortable saying there's something special going on if there's an auditory dimension, and that's worth paying attention to. Yes, Jeff.
I had a couple of questions. One you don't have to answer because it's kind of weird, but
Okay.
The other one is more serious. So the first question is, the weird one is, do deaf or hearing impaired individuals experience auditory
Yes,
hallucination?
which is totally cool. So there's one or two papers, and they seem to have somewhat visual auditory experiences. Totally cool.
So there could be something with the phenomenology there. How you label something as outside, if you know that it can't really be outside, but maybe it still feels like it's outside. You know, if it can't come from outside because you couldn't hear it, it came from outside. Anyway, that's just something, it felt like there could be some kind of interesting natural experiment there with comparing auditory hallucinations in deaf or hearing impaired individuals and seeing how they draw those boundaries. The other question, if you could return to that slide just before. I'm just curious, do those correspond to local categories at all?
No.
Oh, okay.
Well, is that really true?
Well, I was just thinking, because in a place like India, the group one versus some of the other groups, they might just be like Pagal or crazy and not able to become a shaman or be on some path to become a spirit medium.
Right.
And then there could be other people who are touched or gifted or some other vocabulary.
Yeah.
that there could be overlap with those categories, but they would have a different value from the outset.
Right.
And a different possibility of being transformed, for example.
Yeah, so this is, I haven't presented this work to the folks in Ghana. Although I have to say the director of the hospital loved it. So there are plenty of people in hospitals who are flagrantly crazy, brought in by their community. There is a vocabulary word. I'm not going to be able to replicate it or to generate it. The director of the hospital just loved the idea that it was possible that, he actually thought that all of Kung Fu were crazy. So he was, so that it's.
That they could be fixed in some sense.
Now that's a different issue.
Okay.
So there's definitely a turn to, the people are clearly flagrantly crazy. Ghanaian mental health care is, when I was there were something like 24 million people in the country and 11 psychiatrists. It's, most people who are ill are brought to prayer camps with the idea that at least you should first try to get rid of demons. People have different views about how horrific that treatment is. The mental health professionals are very, very agitated about the prayer camps and trying to figure out how to work with the prayer camps. But so these folks, all the Kung Fu that I were talking to, they've all got jobs. They are not. So Vivian is now back talking to the great Mosi, trying to figure out whether we can get even a little more of a sense of whether these Kung Fu are in fact thought to be respectable in their community. They were respectable enough so that when John and Vivian went out to search for them, people said, you should talk to him.
Yeah.
So they're not seen as crazy. And they're doing okay. Yeah.
Do you have information on how much business they do? Like, are there differences just in sort of like number of clients? Because that might be a good way to kind of gauge this. But because salience of someone as an Kung Fu versus I would like to go to them, they will help me. Right. Yeah.
So again, we're trying to get a little better data on that this week. Everyone. So I would ask people. And John and Vivian would ask people, and it was sometimes a little cloudy. Mary was the only one who said 15 to 22. She was very clear. It's a little messy because, like the great Mosi, he's got this big sign. So he wants people to know that he is important, and that sign is out on the road in front of his shrine. He doesn't, so he was willing to say, well, sometimes there's a lot of business, sometimes there's not. He's got a pretty nice house, a pretty big compound. And so we could see that people had biggish compounds. So nobody was living in rank poverty. Rank poverty is a kind of funny concept. It's sort of like what counts as rank poverty here. So we're not totally confident, but it's, what we asked. So they're all, I don't know. That is true. That's one of the.
And does group ones, I don't see the Shishan kind of sounds on this list. Does that distinguish the groups at all, or is that kind of yeah?
So I thought that in general, as you go down this list, the voices become more vivid, imaginatively rich, and less scratchy. As you go up the list, or you go up, the voices become more auditory and more weird.
It strikes me that scratchy is sort of, we have environmental sounds, right? And scratchy could be outside. And so there's something about sort of the plausibility, right? You're alone, but scratchy, right? That draws your attention. It's just interesting.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Because this is ambiguity, right? It's like it could be anything. What could it be? It's not the door. It's not the door. It's not the wall.
Toward sense making of this as an outside sound.
It's interesting. I've heard a number of people describe this shushing sound, and so people have used the phrase "field of rats." It's kind of rushing at me, so it's often pretty unpleasant in my experience. I don't know. I mean, I think that
It feels really organic.
to me it feels really
It's
organic.
that specific sound across
Yeah.
all these cultural contexts.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And it's and so I'm tempted to see that as something that is pretty organic. Again, you get all these arguments about this. Is there a category? But I'm inclined to. That's what I'm inclined to think.
Most of
Yeah.
the time, in my clinical experience, it's not just one kind of sound that they have. So they might have that, there's just different sounds, sometimes voices, sometimes sounds, sometimes more organic sounding, sometimes more formed, sometimes more thought-like. So it's not like, in my experience, there's a lot of variations of the kind of voices that they have. Some have a very systematic one and it's always the same, maybe, but I don't think that, I've rarely heard a patient have just one thing continuously and it just being shushing, and that be the case for many, many patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is habituation. So you start here. I think that when people, and you'll see this in the next. The reason I believe this is true for the next thing, I think that when people fall ill, they often have a much wider variety of experience than when they've been ill for a time. But I think so. Lawrence?
Well, just tangentially, I mean, people with tinnitus hear sounds, they figure out quickly, instantly, that these are generated inside their head, that they're not shared with anybody else, and they can be all kinds of weird sounds. So I don't think there's much intrinsic to the sound, because you can immediately just ask somebody, do you hear that? No? Okay, there is something wrong with my ears. And that's the normal response to having those phenomena. So it implies, again, that this is not about an early sensory process of generating sounds, because we all have that, but the failure to correct that or to locate that with later cognitive processes.
So I think that's true. I think that there is a school of thought out there that will also suggest that what's gone wrong is not that there's something about the social processing that goes wrong. So I think that's Von Bell's view. And there's a sense of, is it social? There's the sense of it's feeling real, because I agree with you. I mean, tinnitus, people don't think it's real. It's
And maybe it also speaks to the idea of salience, and maybe sense not being one thing, because again, with tinnitus, it's very salient. It can interfere with, enjoying your life and everything else. It's like having pain in the foreground. But the salience that troubles people, the hypersalience that troubles people, the psychotic experience is in some ways that it's superimposed on or closely related to their efforts to decide what's socially relevant, what's, so it's in a different category, if you will, a different kind of sorting out of stimuli, different kind of attentiveness.
Paired with the inability to inhibit self-correction of, you hear a click once and then you hear it again, you can, there's studies showing that they're not able to inhibit.
With tinnitus, people are not able to inhibit, and it doesn't habituate.
Yeah, but it's...
But ringing is different than hissing to me. Ringing is a bit...
People don't just have ringing, people have hissing, people have all kinds of...
Oh, tinnitus have hissing.
have all different kinds.
I actually, no, I think it's not just there's a salient sound. I think there's other stuff going on. I mean, I think because I experienced tinnitus. I think people sometimes are overwhelmed at first. I think that changes as though that you can habituate to it. It's not quite clear to me what distinguishes the 10% of people who are driven crazy by their tinnitus from the 90% who aren't. And there's this open question of whether it's volume or something else. But I think that there's this quality of realness to psychotic experience that's quite striking, and I don't think we know how to think about that yet.
But it's not there straight away, usually. The quality of realness is not necessarily always there straight away. So
You
when
mean
you
from the
accompany,
From the onset?
yeah,
of this?
when you accompany someone becoming psychotic, it's in and out of realness, not realness. And it's often thoughts becoming loud, and some of them stay as thoughts that became loud, and some of them then become voices. And so it's not real straight away. There's huge doubts until it becomes real. So, I mean, sometimes you see the full-blown psychosis and then it seems like it was real straight away. But in many other cases where you see them developing the psychosis, like in a FEP, in an early psychotic clinic, you don't know, is this psychotic, is this a teenager, and at some point there's a full-blown psychosis in front of you, but the development was one of in and out.
So I'm totally comfortable with that. I would wonder whether when somebody hears that voice or has that thought, whether they may know that they may wonder about it, but often there's a sense of it's being real, even if they may not believe it. I mean, it's like that's the problem when people have been ill for a while. They know that their experience is a symptom, but it feels real.
But even earlier, they don't know whether it's real, and that's what creates the anxiety that surrounds it. It's the sense of, I have no clue what's going on. I cannot make any sense.
Right. No, I hear you. But I'm wondering whether the felt sense of realness may not be the same thing as, I don't know whether this is real. Whether there's, yeah.
The felt sense of realness may or may not be phenomenologically intrinsic. Something can be very vivid. You
Right.
hallucinate somebody. We do this with hypnotic hallucinations. Is the person you're hallucinating transparent and
Right.
you're seeing through the chair? Well, maybe that's not real. Versus, they're really solid. That must be real. But I think the point that I was making is well taken. It's not always phenomenologically in the hallucinatory experience, whatever. Its reality is not necessarily part of that. Its reality may come later from the fact that it's recurrent, it's persistent, you can't control it.
And you're forced
It
to
must
define
be
it.
something outside you, and you come to,
Well, okay, but let me just raise the possibility that there are many ways in which realness is felt, and that there's the judgment of epistemic realness, it's really there, and wow, that felt real to me, which may not be a judgment of its being really there. And it's, this is one of the things I think is different between religious experience and the psychotic experience, is that I think there's a weirdness and a realness, an emotional realness to the psychotic experience, which I think is often much less present with God, even when it's very salient, even when, and it's hard. I mean, again, this is kind of like the smell of psychosis. I mean, what does that mean? But but there's something that just feels a little different about it, the quality. Yeah.
Speaking of the reality of the experience, I'm curious. In India, what are these individuals? What are they learning to be? What is it, the term again?
Kung Fu.
Kung Fu, yeah. In India, the equivalent would be something like a spirit medium.
Right.
That's where, and that would often be connected to a kind of dissociative experience, but it
Right.
becomes so real that it does overwhelm you in some sense and become
Right.
you. But that's
Right.
not in your four categories. Is that a dimension of this stuff, or is that a different part of the study, or?
Well, all of you Kung Fu are spirit mediums.
They're all spirit mediums.
They're also hearing God.
I see.
And I should say that we heard God too.
Oh.
Which was sort of so John and I are the first time we sat with a great. He takes our schnapps, he sprays it over the God, and then the God clicks, and John and I both hear this, and so I think that it was this kind of Levi-Straussian trickster. Yeah. But I think the great also hears voice. I mean, I think he also has these auditory events, but.
That's interesting. If they all are trancing,
Yes.
then that seems like that would feed into this somehow.
Yeah. So you could say, and as this is one of the puzzles about whether these training practices are helpful for people, maybe people are aided by these practices only when they're also capable of going into trance. Maybe it's the capacity to go into an imaginatively rich state that becomes helpful for you, enables it to be helpful with you for you. So clearly, nobody here, nobody in these groups, none of them have, at least to our knowledge, been inpatients in hospitals. In the top group, they've been taken to the hospital in a couple of cases, and then the doctors released them because nothing was wrong. Yeah.
It's making me think with my transfers, I should be asking them about some of this stuff as well. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Connie.
I was just thinking, you said about going into the imaginatively rich state and psychosis, because I think with meditation, with meditation and psychosis, I think it's the opposite. I think that meditation can be very problematic, and yet the trance maybe. It's just interesting, those two things, because I tended to lump those together.
Yeah, that again is a deep question.
Could you just say a bit about trance as coming from outside of this?
Trance. Okay, so trance is sort of the high point of absorption in some sense, the capacity to have your attention narrow into a particular focus, so that and it's like a deep daydream. As you get into a daydream, the daydream feels more and more real to you, and it feels like you're not in charge of it. So if you're working at a daydream, it's like, you're generating the ideas, and it's not very fun. If you have a really good daydream, it feels more like a dream. It feels like it's happening to you. And as that's happening, people will say that your focus is on what you must imagine, and you disattend to things outside. And so the argument for amnesia is that you become so focused that you lose some kind of connection with executive function, or in some ways. I don't know. Michael probably.
One key feature of this is you're often identifying with a known entity in the spiritual world, so you're a kind of vehicle of a god or an ancestor or a spirit in that trance.
That's the possession part, but you can have trance without possession.
Absolutely. And so in some broad brush, there are two kinds of big-time trance in the world. There's shamanism and spirit possession. In one, your mind goes out into the world and does stuff, heals people, finds tapir, whatever. And the other, the human steps to the back of the closet, whatever that means. The other being comes in. And so it's culturally appropriate that the human wouldn't remember what's being done while the god is in their body. But us, I'm now persuaded that at least many people have some kind of amnestic experience.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear in most, certainly it's clear in the hypnotic setting and so on, the typical experience is not amnestic or not completely amnestic, that people are in and out depending on how they're attending. And then there's usually a norm or prescription you either are or are not supposed to remember, and people will then tell their story in that way. The donkeys that we've interviewed, who invite the god into their body are not supposed to particularly remember things, but if you ask them pointedly, they'll start talking about little bits, and so then you'll get a sense of, okay, they feel like they're standing to one side while this stuff is happening. And it's again a commonplace in hypnosis. It depends on demand characteristics. You can tell people there was a hidden observer, and then people will then generate, there was some, they were watching the whole thing in some way. Some people respond to that. That's suggestions.
Ian Lewis, who wrote one of the foundational books, Ecstatic Religion, he said that spirit possession was a local theory of trance. Mm-hmm. The settings where I work, I don't know how it is here, you would almost never see trance without some attribution of that kind of spiritual. In a religious setting, maybe somewhere else, there would always be some attribution that this is some deity or ancestor or ghost or something like that.
Well, in monotheistic settings, you'd be less likely.
Right. Yeah.
But the Holy Spirit can serve that function. And if you can go, so really good speaking in tongues becomes trance-like, but the person never loses control. They never lose their sense of being the executive in charge of their body. Connie?
I was thinking, it strikes me how much in the last week or 2 weeks that schizophrenia for me is becoming a social binding problem, and that what we talk about when we talk about these things like trance and everything else is this sort of training somehow in ways that can be very beneficial, but the binding is so, I don't know how else to describe it, but that seems to be so fundamental, and I never thought that it was more biological in a way.
So I once heard Arthur Kleinman say, when I talk to psychiatrists, I tell them that none of their categories are real. When I talk to anthropologists, I tell them that, psychiatric categories are real and they'd better figure out how to understand what's happening in their local world. And I sort of feel that way about schizophrenia. I mean, I don't think that if we just put people who come into our clinics into spirit training camps, the schizophrenia would go away. I don't think that's true. But I also think there's something very difficult in a Western setting about the label of schizophrenia. In the U.S., we tend to hospitalize people on the streets. That's not good for them. We tend to keep people isolated. That's not good for them. Entry-level work. There's a lot of stuff that's really tough about the experience of schizophrenia in the States. And Yeah.
What do you make of group 2 becoming group 1? Like there,
Yeah.
or if in a psychiatric terminology, you would say dissociative borderlines with ongoing voices that are more in the trauma realm, suddenly becoming full-blown psychotic. Like, what do you make of that, and have you worked with that at all? And
so, I mean, that's. I don't have a view about that. I'm more immersed in debates where my interlocutors want to say all of psychosis is due to trauma. And I don't think that's true. I do think that people who've been highly traumatized can have vivid voice-hearing experiences. And, the hearing voices movement, which many of you know about. I mean, when I hear people give testimonials from the stage, I'd be tempted to say that many of them have a dissociative disorder. Not all of them. I thought that somebody that I interviewed at length did not. But it's, and I think that it's super hard to, have a clear line that goes between those two. I don't know what.
no, it's just clinically it's a really hard one. Because you can actually train yourself so well. If it's if it's a resource that you have, you can train yourself really well, and it's really hard. It's just a really hard transition, and it fosters huge amounts of discussions in the clinic every time it happens. And I was just wondering what you thought. I don't have an answer either.
And part of the problem is that the categories, some of these processes are quite common, and they can easily co-occur in one person. So whether one thing is turning into another, or whether one thing is just more dominant at some point, and adversity in general may increase the risk of all kinds of things. So yes, you had abuse. Yes, it also is one of many factors that might contribute to the separate abuse, trauma dissociation related process. So I think that's part of the problem. And you look at the numbers of people in this case, we're not going to have representations of all these possible pathways in a sample like this.
Absolutely. And I think it's also super hard to really tear them apart. I'm really confident. I'm pretty confident there's something psychotic-y going on with Mary. And there's something kind of psychotic-y going on with the other people in that category. And but it's really, this is a world of impressions, retrospective memory. You have a sense of what people are saying. It's messy. And I do think that it's possible there's something special about the fact that these folks all are able to dissociate. Yeah.
So the part that impresses me, because I've often sort of argued the other way, that, you know, a healer, a well-functioning, busy healer with a clinical practice can't possibly have schizophrenia because it's just too hard. It's too hard to schedule things. And I mean, I'm thinking, you know, like the healers like me in my office doing psychotherapy. So, I mean, there's lots of aggravation. You have to deal with bureaucracy, et cetera. Anyway, the point is, these people are living and functioning in a different kind of niche, with different kinds of social expectations and supports, which may enable them, despite having a certain amount of cognitive drag and extraneous stuff going on, to still perform and meet the requirements of a social role in a way that is satisfying. And I think that aspect of it, which is now not about understanding what's the mechanism going on for them, but more like, well, what kind of social niche is conducive to someone making some positive use of these ongoing experiences and not being derailed by them, demoralized by them, whatever. I think that's another way to use some of your material that would actually be very helpful from the point of view of social psychiatry, trying to say, how do we help to construct or configure or support niches in which people can thrive despite the fact that they continue to have psychotic experiences.
But I mean, I really am a believer in the psychotic continuum. And so, I mean, what I think what's not clear is whether these are folks who are on the continuum and manage to find some good uses for their talents, or whether they were folks that would be flagrantly psychotic and came back. And so let me just say that the operative word here is may, that these practices may mitigate psychosis. What we see them doing is that what they're trained to do, they're trained to know the gods, to hear their voices more clearly, to distinguish between good and evil voices. There's some story of, arguably, you could say that regardless of what's going on with people, the social practice of naming, knowing, interacting may help people. And I think what you see is that people learn to attend more to the positive desired voice, to attend less to the negative undesired voice. And there's this principle of respect that I think is really important, that I don't think is appreciated with the Hearing Voices group. So with principle of respect, I think, is that these are gods, and so you need to respect them. You don't flee from them. You interact with them. And what I think is kind of cool is that that's what happens in the Hearing Voices community. And I think there's this paradox. The Hearing Voices community, they have the same principle, name, respect, negotiate. I think one possibility is that they're turning voices into people and forcing them into a social relationship. And I think that that's what you see with the gods. The gods become a social relationship. And maybe that reins in some of the negative qualities. Yeah.
So part of what's compelling about that is that along, I guess, two levels. On a simple level, in terms of sort of cognitive dynamics, if you don't fight something, you don't give it power in a way, or you enter in a different kind of relationship. So even with someone like pain, if you're not fighting pain, but just observing pain, you can have a more habitable, viable relationship. Similarly in this context. But the other thing I was going to say is this is very close to Jung's idea of active imagination in the more general realm of individuation of human development. That you encounter these other imaginary beings, images of the unconscious, whatever, and you treat them with respect, you treat them as autonomous, you treat them as real, and you enter into dialogue with them. And in so doing, you begin to work out a relationship. And in some sense, that's a relationship with a fuller sense of self. And so for Jung's point of view, this is actually developing a spiritual sense in a way that enlarges your sense of who you are and gives meaning to life. So he sees this as a growth, not just as a healing process, but as a growth-oriented process in a sense for me.
Yeah, and there's a lot to say about the active imagination and these imaginative practices and what's going on and what's doing the healing. So recently I was looking back at my God material, And I decided that I actually saw two separate training processes, or this is looking at some of our Tulpamancer interviews, that there is this process of, teaching yourself to see the experience more vividly. And so the Tulpamancers, some of the training, particularly the older style of the 2013 training, which was so long ago, people would I want to make this pony real for me, so I'm going to look at its eyelashes, and I'm going to look at its tail, and I'm going to spend 15 minutes really visually describing its tail, which is kind of the Ignatian spiritual exercises approach. And there's another approach, which is I'm just going to pretend it's there. It's going to be human to me. And those are arguably different dimensions of training. One is more social, one is more sensory. They work well together, but they're different. And so the dynamic story is much more about this is a human, I'm engaging with this human, how can I allow this to change me? Yeah.
You talked about a moral attitude, that you're treating that other being as having moral agency.
Right.
So that implies a certain kind of, it's the respect element, the seriousness element, the affectively charged element. There's things that are being brought to bear there that are not primarily sensory, that maybe have more to do with affect and more to do with relational aspects.
But I think that's like at one level, but I think there's a level of just gaining control by naming, by locating, and by simply sort of establishing a relationship. You already have more control than if there is no relationship. So there's a huge part of gaining control over it that it happens at a much more immediate level. As soon as you label it, as soon as you recognize it, as you can identify it, you've already controlled it a little bit more than not. It's part of psychotherapy. As soon as you create a distance, you have a different relationship to it. So there's a lot of distance creating that is occurring here. Yes.
I think that's true. And kind of the magical power of the name comes from someplace deep within the human experience. Let me quickly trundle through some of my other data. And so I'll zoom through the first chunk of this because I sent it around to you. But I did this study in which we talked to persons with psychosis who hear voices. We did this in 3 parts of the world. I was working with colleagues in these 3 parts of the world. And then I did all the interviews in the States. In Accra, I did all of the interviews in English, but I had a Ghanaian research assistant by my side, and then I went away and I sent her back in, and she found the same pattern of experience. In Chennai, that my colleagues did the interviews first in Tamil, and then I flew in and interviewed 5 of their people and another 15 people. So they're all in the hospital care. I basically was interested in 2 things. Can you remember? Do you have positive experiences? And do you know who's talking? Not do you recognize the voice, but do you know in the flesh the person who is talking to you? And I hope this is not offensive to people, but this is slightly. I'm going to give you a caricature that I find slightly amusing, which is that Americans hear horrible voices telling them that they're worthless, they should die. Africans hear an audible God who tells them to ignore evil voices. And South Asians hear annoying relatives who tell them to get dressed and to clean up. And so I think that's actually true, more or less true. So let me zoom through the first part of this. To Americans, hearing a voice means that you're crazy. So 20 people in each sample, and we've now got multiple samples. Very robust. Americans don't know who is speaking, so if much smaller numbers say, it was my father, it was my therapist in these samples. It's not true for everybody. In America, the voices are often violent. That's very striking in these Californian samples. Not one American in the first sample said that their dominant voice hearing experience was positive. Not one. And I've since talked to more people for whom some do say that, but it's a very striking feature of these conversations. Chennai, over half the sample hears kin. That means that there are many people who don't hear kin, but over half the sample hears kin. can insist on good behavior. So they can be very annoying, but they say don't drink and smoke. At least a third of the sample had some positive voices. A lot of people talk about sex. And so there's a sense that in Chennai, sex, is all over psychotic experience. But it was, be kind of willing to say that where the Americans talk about the violence of the voices, in Chennai, people talk about walking onto a public bus and having their voices tell everybody that they're masturbating. So when your voices are mean, this is a caricature, but sex becomes much more charged and a sign of social misbehavior in Chennai. Accra, hearing voices doesn't mean that you're crazy. More people know who's speaking. This was the striking experience. God is often speaking. God is often a help. I often had to work to find any negative experiences. And then people would often say, well, God tells me not to pay attention. A very powerful phenomenon. People are more likely to say that the voices keep them company. It's a very striking observation that compared to the US, that folks in Chennai and Accra are more likely to report positive experiences, to use those positive experiences, and more likely to know who's speaking, to be able to have a sense of who's interacting. Okay, so is this really true? So I played you remember that track that I played you? So I did another sample in the US, and Accra and Chennai. And so what I would do is I went into the inpatient facility, San Francisco General Hospital. I did this in the Accra Hospital and in Chennai at SCARF. And these were shorter interviews. I played the track. We talked a little about voices, then I played the track. And I said, I'm going to ask you whether this is like your voice hearing experience. But the first question I asked was, what do you remember from this track? In Accra, 29 subjects, 9 remembered some version of the positive voice, and 8 described it as a movie. And this is all, and this is Infante. In Chennai, 27 subjects, 7 remember some version of the positive voice, I came for you. 10 describe it as a story. San Francisco General, 0 remember the positive voice, and none describe it as a story. And they hated it. So I would say that in America, and maybe, in America, people really didn't like this track, people in the San Francisco General Hospital. So, it's a weird thing. I'm playing this track. Maybe it just has more Anyway, I also did this. So let's see if I can do this. I played them these tracks developed by Diana Deutsch. And this probably won't work, but see if you allow this to work for you. I'm going to play a short track. Most humans, if it's in stereophonic sound, can hear words emerging out of this track. So see if you will allow yourself to hear words. Work for anyone? Mind? Kind? It's a lot of variation. Let me show you. This is another one. I also played them this. Work for people? Okay. So I did something really simple with this. I said, are the words that people are reporting to me, are they good neutral or are they bad? So here's some good neutral words: bright light, clay, like that, yak. Negative words: he lie, fatal grade, go away, don't fuck with me, no love. It's and so it's, and then I went through and I said, what did people say? Accra, 6 people generated negative words for at least one track. Chennai, 3 people generated negative words for at least one track. Use San Francisco General Hospital, 12 people generate negative words for at least one track. So it kind of looks like Americans really do have some kind of negative bias, or at least this work suggests that interpretation. So this is my claim. Yeah.
What setting? Oh, they're all in hospitals.
They're all in hospitals. I'm a weirdo showing up and playing this track. I'm carrying an iPod, or not an iPad, an iPad, and we have a conversation, and then I press this thing, and just write down what they say. So that's kind of interesting. So I think that there's an habituation story. That's, at least this is a plausible argument, that there's people have an array of stuff, that there's a story of selective attention that's kind of narrowing what you're willing to attend to, encourage, and respond to. Why do we care? Well, you can make the claim that Americans become more agitated, more distressed by their psychosis than other people. Best data comes from India. That seems to be relatively robust. And I'll end here. I mean, why does this matter for psychiatry? I think, biomedical orientation is to ask patients to ignore their voices rather than engage with their voices. Not all voice hearing is psychotic. Not all psychotic process is ill. And spiritual practices can be fundamentally psychotherapeutic. So, all right. More questions, comments? It's 12:29. Yes?
I'm curious about the selective attention piece and how that relates potentially to the training that individuals go through to become a congruent, whether there is, I don't know, I just kept thinking about like a dichotic listening paradigm and sort of like pulling out the positive or the negative, and whether there is something that's sort of a skill that's being. Yeah.
No, so that's exactly what I think that the Kung Fu training is about. It's about, pulling out the positive voice, identifying it as God, developing a relationship with it, naming the negative voices as being things you're not concerned with them, but you know their names, you probably know how to deal with them. Your God knows how to deal with them. And, and then moving forward. I mean, I do think it was a really, this paper's not yet written either, but it's there's a really robust story about an idiom of healing in Ghana that I think that I was very struck by, which was this sense that God helps me deal with this. That God, God teaches me how to deal with these negative voices. That's abundantly true of the Kung Fu, but it's true, but I kept hearing it in the hospital. And I mean, not from everybody, but from a quarter to a third of the people that I was talking to. And I think that's quite striking. Yeah.
Great talk. I love hearing about all this stuff. I have a question. I think it's going to be something we'll have to talk about, in an ongoing conversation. But I would say one of my central interests these days is it's almost like taking some of that Michael Marmot Whitehall study, that connection between social status and health, and generalizing it, cross-culturally, but also with religion.
You've already done that.
Yeah, some of that, but religion playing a really key role of defining people, helping people redefine their value and raise their status, and then maybe improve their health in different ways. What I'm seeing here, I'm curious, it looks like a kind of sub-example it's like a sub-case of that. it's like someone has a devalued status because of a disease, right? And so through these processes of reevaluation, they might improve that, that value, that status in their health. But I see this as part of a much larger phenomenon of many people, and I work with like Dalits in India. You might have a devalued status for other like socio-political reasons, and maybe religion is helping, along similar paths. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. Does that seem to ring with what some of the things you're saying?
Absolutely. So I think that, this imaginative world that we all live in part, we can do a lot more with that. I mean, that's hardly original. I mean, that is, that is Carl Jung, that is Jerome Frank, that's Freud for that matter. But I think that we're all engaged in interacting with, from the broadest perspective, our own ghosts. And that if you, if you learn to interact more effectively, then you're much better off. I mean, there's no question, but from my point of view, there's no question, but if you can develop a positive relationship with a loving God, you are better off. It's not clear that society is better off with your version of a loving God, but the person who has this vivid, imaginatively rich discussion.
Also that vision is sanctioned in some way.
Yeah.
By a community, and, like-minded individuals, right?
Yeah, it's much more likely to be effective if it's sanctioned. I mean, and so if you got a tulpa, you're much better off if you're in a tulpa. I think in a tulpa master community, there are people giving you a lot of support. I think because I think maintaining the realness is tough. It's so the more you can, if your social world shares with your sense that this is a being who is interacting with you, and you can interact with that being, I think you're right. No, I think it's. I mean, a lot of the health research was initially based on church attendance. So the variable was how often do you go to church? And the more often you go to church, the better off your body is. And there's a smaller number of studies that look at what's your relationship with God. But now that work does seem to predict, be associated with a healthier body. Yeah.
I think going back to the schizophrenia or psychosis, I think there's also a value alignment, that your experience and values are aligned in that social context which gives a space for interaction in that value alignment, which doesn't happen in other contexts. There is just no value alignment. So.
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, there is the question of whether, kids with imaginary companions, they often do better they tend to do well as they age. It's not like there's great data. But, so they're not in a value alignment per se. If folks in Jungian therapy are not in a value alignment with their interaction with the hermit. But, but I still think those imaginative...
I agree.
Yeah.
But I think another element, I don't think it's only, but I think there's another element.
Yeah, I think they're absolutely right. And again, if you can get your community on board with your relationship with this God, I mean, that's one of the things that's so impressive about the evangelical community, is that whatever one thinks about the representation of God that they value, you look at folks at Bethel, where there's a very, very loving God and a very immediate presence of God, and people are just goopily happy. I mean, you see the experience of the body. It's and that is a world with a very tight shared set of values, and a lot of work to maintain the presence of this interacting God. Yes?
Could you tell us a bit about people at the margins of these communities? For example, I suppose in evangelical communities there are some people who have delusions or hearing voices that that appear to be in harmony with the whole context and the symbolical world that these people live in, but that their own community consider to be silly and not usual kind of thing they're supposed to have. Does that happen?
Sure. I mean, so you get. I know this more through my ethnographic experience, that there were people in these churches who were a little odd. In some cases, clearly, to my eyes, clearly psychotic. In some cases, homeless. And the community was often the community could clearly identify that there was something different about these people. It seemed that their experience of God was likely very good for them compared to other experiences that they might have. It's a little messy. So the folks when I was hanging out on the streets of Chicago, there were many religious people, and God was not always such a great guy. So one woman that I knew kept copious notes of the ways that women had been raped in the Bible. Not always, and sometimes there were more stories that she kept notes on than may have been represented in the text. And so her God was a pretty difficult God. So I think, the content does matter. But yeah, I can see that we're heading off for lunch, or that we're having. It's So.
I don't know if people want to stay and talk. That's fine. I do have to go to another meeting. And I think our official time is coming to an end. So what I want to do is, please, if you have time to stay, that's great, and other people can chat. But I do want to thank you very much for really a terrific morning. I think we've all benefited immensely from this beautiful program of research and how all the pieces fit together very elegantly. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Good discussion. Very good. Good discussion. Thank you.